It's been a while since I've read a 1920s novel. The Beautiful and Damned was my last review, but I actually read it a long time before I made that video. I've done enough book reviews to warrant a compilation video, but I'm only including the first 5 that I did. I'll save the F. Scott Fitzgerald ones for a separate collection for just his 3 1920s novels. I re-recorded all the audio for these reviews, and made some minor changes to the scripts. But the visuals are still pretty bare bones, so this is more like a literature podcast, I guess. But I go fairly deep into the books, so I hope that balances things out. Anyway, let's put on our fancy hats and get into the literature. One of my absolute favorite novels of all time is from the 1920s, and it's one that gets talked about much less in the mainstream than The Great Gatsby or The Sun Also Rises. An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser, published in 1925, I think deserves much more attention than it usually gets outside of academia. Among experts, it gets plenty of praise, and it's often featured on lists of great novels. But I don't know, I never seem to hear anyone talk about it, or any of Dreiser's other books, like you often hear about F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway, if that makes any sense. First, a little background on the author and the book. Theodore Dreiser was a pretty interesting guy. A random fun fact is that he nearly boarded the Titanic for its fateful voyage. At the time An American Tragedy was published, Dreiser was in his 50s, and his career had been at a severe low point for several years. He had previously written 5 novels and a short story collection, but to little commercial success. Though his first novel, Sister Carrie, has since become pretty famous, and I've read it. It's pretty good if you ever get a chance. Anyway, Dreiser started the manuscript for An American Tragedy in 1920, but abandoned it, then took it up again 3 years later, and published it in late 1925. Unlike his previous books, this one sold rather well, though didn't propel him to any legendary status or anything like that at the time. The novel begins with our main character, Clyde Griffiths, growing up through his adolescent years. He was raised in a strict religious household, with proselytizing evangelist parents, though he strays away from their teachings in pursuit of pleasure and hedonism. He's able to get a job as a soda jerk, then upgrades to a bellboy at one of the finest hotels in Kansas City, and starts receiving a sizable paycheck, and becomes friends with many of the other bellboys. Together, they seek pretty young women inside and outside of brothels, engage in drinking parties, and overall sinful fun. Clyde loves having more financial freedom, and starts using it to spoil one of his crushes, who doesn't even really like him that much, but shows him attention because he lavishes her with gifts. He even goes so far as to make a down payment on a fur coat for her, despite it being above his means. Even worse, he does this instead of helping to support his pregnant and abandoned sister. This is the first time Clyde is seduced and corrupted by money. After a night of partying and drinking, the group of bellboys and a few young women are involved in a hit and run that results in the death of a little girl, and they all flee from the police and start new lives in new cities, leaving 2 members of the group, a boy and a girl who were unconscious at the scene, to take all the punishment. Clyde makes his way to Chicago, leaving his old life behind out of fear of being locked up for many years. By chance, he meets his rich uncle at the hotel he's working at, and asks for a job at his collar factory. Clyde's father had virtually excommunicated himself from his family, including his rich brother, Samuel. Uncle Samuel feels bad for Clyde, as well as Clyde's father, whom Samuel feels was treated unfairly by their father. So Clyde moves to Lycurgus in upstate New York. Meanwhile, his cousin, Gilbert Griffiths, the heir to the profitable factory business, is in charge of assigning Clyde his job. Gilbert is jealous and suspicious of Clyde, since he was now a threat to his inheritance. So he assigns Clyde to the most menial job. But Samuel, his uncle, soon overrides this, and Clyde is reassigned to a supervising position. Now Clyde begins to experience the wonders of a high social status. Even though he's only a nephew to the factory's wealthy owner, he still shares the family name that is held in such high esteem in the area. And even though his uncle had said that he wouldn't give Clyde preferential treatment, he does anyway by promoting him based entirely on his family connection. Clyde, however, is still immature, and still prone to seeking out the hedonistic pleasures in life, but especially women. He becomes romantically involved with one of the young women he supervises named Roberta, despite this being strictly against the company's rules. After some fun, he becomes less interested in her in favor of a young, wealthy socialite named Sandra. He knows that Sandra can provide all the things he truly wants, money and status. Sandra really just wants him as a boy toy, though she's still perfectly willing to marry him for that. But there's a problem, a big problem. It turns out that Clyde had gotten Roberta pregnant, and back then, it was a huge stain on your character to have a child out of wedlock, especially for women. But more importantly to Clyde, this would mean that he had broken the company's rules, and he would almost definitely be fired and shunned by his rich relatives. Clyde and Roberta secretly try everything to terminate the pregnancy. Pills of dubious quality and trying to gather information about doctors that would perform illegal abortions, but nothing comes of it. Clyde becomes increasingly more desperate. He can see his future life of wealth and comfort disappearing right before his eyes, just because of some pesky factory girl who is threatening to reveal the story. Roberta desperately needs financial compensation from Clyde if he wasn't going to take responsibility and marry her, because her family is dirt poor and would not be able to support a baby very well, if at all. He starts entertaining thoughts of getting rid of her, permanently, so he can finally achieve what he believes is true happiness. He finally makes up his mind to follow through with the plan, and tells Roberta he will marry her, and put all of this behind them. He takes her to a quiet lake in a boat in a sparsely populated area, with the intention of knocking her into the water with an oar, stunning her and leaving her to drown, knowing that she can't swim. But when they're in the boat, he accidentally hits Roberta with his camera as she suddenly leans forward towards him and capsizes the boat, and she drowns. Clyde wonders if he'll be blamed for it, or if it'll be seen as an accidental death. But realizing the circumstances were too suspicious, he decides to flee the scene of the crime, committing himself to his ironically botched murder, thinking, or at least hoping, that he can get away with it. Clyde thought he had taken every possible precaution, even signing hotel registers under 2 different pseudonyms, though both using the same letters as his real initials, CG. So it makes it obvious that it was all premeditated. And the local coroner is able to figure out his real name very quickly by identifying Roberta from a letter in her pocket, then questioning her parents, and her mother said that she had only been seeing one young man recently, Clyde Griffiths. The coroner almost doesn't believe that Clyde was the true murderer because of how obvious the evidence was against him. That if he was the murderer, he was not a very bright one. To make a long story short, Clyde is eventually tried and convicted of murder, and is ultimately sent to the electric chair. So that's the book in a nutshell. But what does it mean? What does it say about the 1920s? First, as I've said in many of my videos, the 1920s in America was a time of relative prosperity. Or at the very least, there were more eccentric new money people, and new ways to get rich quick, making wealth seemingly more possible for ordinary people. And many young people seem to be becoming obsessed with money and hedonistic activities, almost to the point of absurdity. The wealthy, beautiful, and eccentric celebrities, especially in the film industry, were the idols of youth, an ideal that young people wanted to achieve for themselves. With the plot in an American tragedy, the novel could very well have been written as a satire, and the reader could have enjoyed themselves laughing at the misery Clyde brought upon himself. But Dreiser's tone remains serious throughout, which rules out satire. Nothing is too absurd. Clyde seems like he's bumbling and blundering around, blindly in pursuit of wealth and status. But the serious tone and the way his flaws end up destroying him is what makes it a tragedy. That and the irony of the ending. He plans to murder Roberta, but she dies accidentally instead, and then all of Clyde's naive attempts at covering his tracks are what lead to his capture. When the drive to obtain material riches became too intense, it ended in tragic failure, resulting in Clyde's death. Dreiser might be critical of these kinds of people, but he's also somewhat sympathetic to their fate. From my very brief look at other people's thoughts about the book, some have criticized the first part of the book about Clyde's childhood as being too long-winded and detailed, because it doesn't contribute to the overall plot. But I disagree, because it's necessary in order to understand Clyde's motivations and mindset. Why he behaves the way he does is extremely important for the overall message of the novel. Part of this has to do with morals. Clyde had been raised in a strict religious household that was too suffocating to be healthy. However, it had given him a strong moral code that, at the time, would definitely have been admirable in a young man. But because his parents had been too strict, this made him want to rebel, to go against their values. I'm not sure how important Dreiser intended this commentary to be, but it definitely feels intentional. A good foreshadowing of Clyde's corrupted morals or empathy occurs when the whole problem with his sister arises. He chooses not to help her in her time of dire need, instead throwing away all of his money on a fur coat for his questionable love interest. And of course, he tries to do a similar thing later with Roberta, by not helping her when he really should, especially because, in that instance, it was his own fault, and therefore his responsibility. At the beginning of the novel, we feel bad for Clyde, and we're rooting for him to discover the world and enjoy himself after such a miserable childhood. But as the story progresses, he becomes more and more unlikable. His desire for money and status consume him and warp his previous sense of morality. He would rather marry Sandra, who, even though she later says she does, I would argue doesn't truly love him. And he doesn't love her either. He just wants all the perks that come with marrying a rich girl. And instead, our sympathy moves on to Roberta, who Clyde abandons despicably, mirroring the image of his practically destitute pregnant sister, who had also been abandoned by the man who had gotten her pregnant earlier in the story. But when Roberta dies, who do we sympathize with anymore? Even though Clyde hadn't meant for her to die the way she did, he had still planned on killing her somehow. And a big part of the reason he wanted to kill her was just because her pregnancy threatened his shallow pursuit of material wealth. At this point in the story, I loathed Clyde. I hated him, as I imagine everyone else probably would too. But if you think back to Clyde earlier in the story, you might feel a little tiny bit of sympathy banging around inside, especially if you subscribe to the idea that he was at least partially set up for this by his upbringing. But it's pretty much impossible to sympathize with what he's become. And we can also sympathize at least somewhat with his motive. A lot of people want wealth and high status. He just took it too far, past the point of moral rectitude. So essentially, the way I see it, the story is a warning to not blindly chase after material wealth, because you'll probably get hurt or possibly even ruin your life. But the thing is, Clyde's desires are much like our own, and it's kind of terrifying to think that we could find ourselves in a similar situation if we act on it too much. If we just gradually go further and further, we could find ourselves doing something morally reprehensible. Money can corrupt morals, even strongly held ones, if the desire for success is too strong. And I don't think it's a coincidence that this novel's commentary came about in the 1920s. Obviously, Clyde is an extreme example, but that's why the gradual stages of his moral decay are so important to the commentary. Maybe an average person like us won't murder someone for our own gain, but we could find ourselves at the stage where we start to lose empathy. And I think this brings up another point. Clyde doesn't seem to develop much in terms of maturity. Is this because of him chasing his dream without thinking about other things? Is Dreiser calling these money chasers inherently immature? Or is this just a device to show that in these kinds of situations, your immaturity will ultimately lead to your failure, and that alone should deter you from pursuing it further? Or were these failures due simply to the guilt that tortured Clyde throughout the process? I don't know the answers, I'm just asking. If you've read the book, what do you think? It's also interesting to think about what Clyde was sacrificing to gain wealth and status by marrying Sandra. At that time, being a man, Clyde would have been expected to have been the provider in the relationship, but he seems perfectly willing to push that aside. Sandra even gives him money to pay for things for her in public, so it would appear normal, though Clyde doesn't ask her to do that. And Sandra panders to him in other ways as well. She uses so much baby talk with him that it sounds almost demeaning, like Clyde is a little puppy. And that certainly would have been a hit to most any other man's pride and masculinity at the time. But Clyde's pursuit of wealth has practically erased his dignity as a man, or at least what society deemed masculine behavior. And he's content simply to reap the benefits of money. It makes me wonder if there was an intentional commentary on masculinity in there somewhere. There was, after all, a lot of talk in the 1920s of men becoming more feminine and women becoming more masculine. I also found it interesting that all the rich people in the novel are not presented as being bad people. The closest would be Gilbert, but you could easily dismiss him as just being young and immature, and thus prone to jealousy, though not necessarily a bad person. Samuel Griffiths, Clyde's uncle and the owner of the factory, is not presented as being a bad person either. Maybe a little bit of a hypocrite, but certainly not the ruthless business tycoon you might expect him to be. At least, that's not the side of him we're shown. Sandra, too, is not a bad person. More than a little silly, yes, but harmless. It's not like she's stringing Clyde along. He's perfectly willing to go along with it. Her family is overly concerned about status, but we don't see them do anything explicitly immoral to retain it. On the other hand, Clyde, the one who aspires to be like them, uses blatantly immoral means, including abortion, which, at the time, would have been more than frowned upon by most people. Regardless of what people think about abortion now, in the context of this book, it's intended to be going against the moral code of 1920s society. And then, of course, there was Clyde's plan to murder Roberta. And the other bellboys in the first part of the book had questionable morals as well, with them going to prostitutes and getting drunk during Prohibition. And once again, these were considered either immoral or in a moral gray area in the context of the book. Then, their explicitly immoral act of fleeing the scene after running over and killing a child. But I have a feeling it serves a different purpose of more clearly showing a divide between the characters. But what that divide actually means, I'm not too sure. Like, is it old money versus new money? I can't imagine that Dreiser is trying to say that old money people were all morally upstanding, or that lower class people had less moral restraints. But let me know what you think in the comments. I want to hear your theories if you have any. If I had any criticism of An American Tragedy, I guess it'd be that if some cuts had to be made, I think it should be some of the courtroom scenes. They go on for like 200 pages or something like that in my copy of the book. It does feel like you're experiencing it in real time, but those scenes alone are almost novel length in themselves. I didn't hate them, but after a while, it did kind of drag a little bit for me. I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, it is the climax of the story, sort of. So maybe it should be as long as it is. Well, what do you think? So, those were just some of my random thoughts after reading through the book. There's a lot to unpack in this novel, and I don't usually do this kind of literary analysis kind of thing, but I hope this was at least somewhat interesting. I highly recommend reading An American Tragedy if you haven't already. Its commentary isn't just about its own time, but there are some universal things as well. But be warned, it's a long book. Though I will say that it reads very smoothly, at least I thought so. The style is very modern, with some old-fashioned words thrown in here and there. And even though it's so long, I was really engaged and sped through the pages. So yeah, definitely get this book if you want something to read from the 1920s. Maybe with enough people reading it again, it can get the mainstream recognition it deserves. I'm always fascinated with how some books can be so poorly received in their time and then praised as top-tier literary masterpieces decades later, and how other books are so popular in their time but are relatively obscure now. Of course, a good example of the first kind is The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, which only really became widely acknowledged as a masterpiece about 20 years after its original publication, and is now a household name around the world. Then for the second kind, there's Main Street by Sinclair Lewis, which doesn't seem to have quite the same name recognition or cultural importance now as other 1920s novels, such as The Great Gatsby, The Sun Also Rises, or All Quiet on the Western Front. You can't call it forgotten, really, but compared to the 1920s, its prestige has diminished quite a bit for some reason. At the time of its publication in 1920, Main Street was a massive success. Within the first 6 months, around 180,000 copies were sold. Or, as the introduction of my edition stated, nearly every novel-reading American read it. It reached even beyond the normal book market, appearing on household shelves that bore only a handful of volumes besides the Bible. And in the context of the 1920s, this was a common theme for Sinclair Lewis. He was one of the very, very few authors who were able to be critically praised and write multiple big bestsellers. If you look at the list of the top 10 best-selling books of each year of the 1920s, you'll be hard-pressed to find many recognizable names. Yet Lewis appears in these top 10 lists 5 times, meaning that 5 of his 7 novels published in that decade made the top 10. In terms of cultural impact, this makes Sinclair Lewis perhaps the most important American writer of the 1920s. So now with some of the background information out of the way, let's get into Main Street. First off, it's important to note that most of the book does not take place in the 1920s. It was only published at the very beginning of the decade, and the first half takes place in the few years before the start of World War I, so the early 1910s. The main character of the novel is Carol, a young Minnesota woman who just graduated from college and has just started her job as a librarian in St. Paul, Minnesota. She soon meets an older doctor named Will Kennicott, and they get married. Mr. Kennicott is excited to be taking his new bride back to his small hometown of Gopher Prairie, Minnesota. At first, Carol feels the excitement of being newly married, but pretty quickly starts having reservations about living in a small town. She finds that she liked the excitement of the city, and has mixed feelings about the denizens of Gopher Prairie. She annoys her new husband a bit by complaining about the town. Carol is a modern woman. She's intelligent, she loves literature, and she's a college graduate. And Gopher Prairie is not really a modern town in any sense. She feels the people there judging her, invading her privacy, almost immediately. In one of her hectic internal thoughts, she imagines bearded, sniffy old men sitting and demanding that we bear children. If they had to bear them, I wish they did have to. If anyone watching this video is from a small town, you'll probably find the portrait that Lewis paints to be both funny and true. My favorite detail is that there's a man named Percy Bresnahan from Gopher Prairie who became a successful businessman in the East. Carol is asked by one person if she knew that Percy was from Gopher Prairie. This was new information for her, so she learned it. But in the same day, she is asked the same question at least 2 more times. Anyone who has ever lived in a small town will know that if anyone from that town becomes a big shot in a city somewhere, the townsfolk have a tendency to never shut up about it. At a get-together, a few citizens perform little skits and dances, and it's mentioned that Carol saw many of the same exact performances more than a dozen times just that winter, sometimes by the same person. This shows how virtually everyone in town is so easily entertained and complacent doing the same activities over and over. As far as reading material in the town goes, the highest class things mentioned had titles such as Mid the Magnolias and Writers of Ranch Reckless, which sounds something more akin to forgettable pulp fiction than anything of real literary value to Carol. She later talks to a man who says he tried to read a Balzac book, but it was too scandalous for him. Instead, this man finds movies better because they're censored and not likely to have anything inappropriate. In the whole town, there are only like 2 people who are interested in real literature. The townsfolk are predictably quite conservative. Mr. Kennicott gently warns his wife not to shock people by speaking of her stockings, ankles, or legs, and other immoral stuff. And these kinds of comments continue for a while. The townspeople are also afraid of anything that so much as hints at socialism or communism, especially the all-feared farmers' communes. Carol also finds out that the women in town cannot freely use money, but have to get it from their husbands, who can refuse to give it at any time and for whatever reason. Carol finds herself in this kind of situation, and when she confronts her husband about it, he says he simply forgot, though the narration adds cheekily, and after that, he remembered to give her money regularly, sometimes. As more evidence for the townspeople's conservatism, one man goes on a lengthy monologue that summarizes the political stance and general attitude of most of the men in town, and it goes like this. All this profit-sharing and welfare work and insurance and old age pension is simply poppycock, enfeebles a workman's independence, and wastes a lot of honest profit. The half-baked thinker that isn't dry behind the ears yet, and these suffragettes, and God knows what all Batinskys there are that are trying to tell a businessman how to run his business, and some of these college professors are just about as bad. The whole kit and bilin of them are nothing in God's world but socialism in disguise. And it's my bounden duty as a producer to resist every attack on the integrity of American industry to the last ditch. Yes, sir. Even though this book was made 100 years ago, I think that this attitude is still surprisingly accurate in many small towns even today. And here's just a fun little side note that I found interesting. It's mentioned that the people of Gopher Prairie say American instead of American. This appears to be the forerunner to the Murica that we all know today. So anyway, Carol hosts a big party, and despite quite a few signs to the contrary, she thinks that she has improved her standing with everyone. But she finds out from one of her closer acquaintances, a woman named Vita Sherwin, that in fact, what she believed to be a generously large party offended some people by its lavishness, and that they took it as a challenge to anyone else to one-up her. Because her husband is a doctor, he makes more money than most others in town, and some people thought that she was showing off his wealth, which of course she hadn't intended. The townspeople look into everything Carol does and see a deeper meaning that was never supposed to be there, like her party. It was also mentioned that one store owner was offended that Carol had brought furniture from the city instead of buying it in town. It's not directly stated, but it's not unreasonable to assume that the store owner might have thought that Carol thought that the quality of the local furniture was worse, and that's why she didn't buy it. Carol also makes the mistake of praising her servant, B. Sorensen, who, along with the other Scandinavian immigrants in town, is scorned by the other townspeople. But B thinks of Gopher Prairie in the exact opposite way as Carol, regarding it as a beautiful place. Despite their differing views on that subject, the two of them get along very well. Their chumminess is also in spite of Carol's upbringing, when she was taught to scorn the servant class. Carol also starts talking with Guy Pollock, a man described as a bit of a hermit. He's not especially close with many people in town, which is pretty rare there. But he's a well-read man, something that Carol finds irresistibly attractive, though she feels guilty about these feelings. He also tells her that all the doctors in town, implying that her husband is included, gyp people out of more money by making unnecessarily long house calls, which bothers Carol. A little less than halfway through the book, Carol and Will have a big argument about their differing views of Gopher Prairie and the people there. In this long and heated argument, both of them have fair points. Carol criticizes the townspeople for failing to appreciate her effort despite the big challenge of adjusting to small-town life. Will calls Carol out on her high and mighty and too outwardly intellectual attitude towards many people, as well as her obvious disgust for certain habits, which he finds pretentious. Carol also brings up what Guy Pollock told her about the doctors, but doesn't name him. Will denies charging extra or gypping people out of more money, but says that he does want to save enough money for them to have a comfortable life together. They both soften, and by the end of their conversation, they've reached an understanding, and Carol is now sure that she loves him. We soon see, too, that Will was telling the truth about not being greedy for money, when he couldn't care less that one woman couldn't pay him at the moment for a late-night house call, and assured her that it was fine. Carol tries to get some sophistication into the town with the establishment of a theater association. After a lengthy debate on which play to do, Carol doesn't like any of the other suggestions, but is outvoted. Most of the townspeople don't take the rehearsals seriously, and on opening night, Carol is mortified at the performance as a whole. The audience didn't see it quite so negatively. Most enjoyed it, though as one person remarked, they would rather have seen a movie with auto chases and less talking than a play. Every ticket was sold, the audience was relatively satisfied, the local newspapers gave a positive review, but Carol was very disappointed, and the actors didn't seem interested in putting on another play anytime soon. Throughout the novel, Carol seems to fall in and out of favor with the townspeople. When her son Hugh is born, some of Will's relatives, Aunt Bessie and Uncle Whittier, drop in unexpectedly and stay with them. They annoy Carol to no end with their constant pestering. They're like many of the others in town, except they're in constant close proximity and extra nosy. and they're horrified when Carol says she doesn't want to have Hugh christened. Carol isn't very religious, something else that makes people suspicious of her. Around this time, we also get to hear some of the townspeople's silly arguments. My favorite one was when one man complained about another man because he said that the wind had been blowing south the previous Tuesday, when in fact it had been blowing southwest. Then the novel switches over to Vida Sherwin's perspective, and we learn of her backstory. It turns out that Will had aggressively flirted with her some years before he had met Carol. Vida had firmly rejected his advances, and it seems that he flirted with a lot of women back then. But when he came back to Gopher Prairie with Carol, a city girl who was much younger than him, Vida, still unmarried herself, became very jealous, despite Carol's shared interest in literature. But then Vida falls in love with a local man named Ramey Wutherspoon, and they get married fairly quickly. Vida's confidence improves, but she still has some jealousy toward Carol and Will, partly because Will has a higher status in town than Mr. Wutherspoon. Carol and Vida have a bit of a falling out. Vida confronts Carol about her desire to reform the town, but having made virtually no progress. Meanwhile, other people in town have won some victories, small ones, but more than Carol has done. The antithesis to the values of Gopher Prairie comes in the form of Miles Bjornstam. At the beginning of the novel, Miles is a bit of a contract worker, not having any desire to tie himself down with a real job in a town that he hates. He's agnostic and has socialist tendencies, completely at odds with the town's deep religiousness and complete aversion to anything socialist. Later on, Miles marries Bea, Carol's former housekeeper. Miles then becomes motivated to be successful in his own modest way, and starts up a dairy farm. Then they have a son named Olaf, and they are a happy, healthy family, though not very well off financially. They're isolated from the others in town, who generally avoid them like the plague, except Carol, who not only visits, but also brings her son Hugh to play with Olaf. She does, however, feel a bit self-conscious of her association with them at one point. But both Bea and Olaf die tragically from typhoid, and Miles leaves town, and he would have been run out by the townspeople anyway if he had tried to stay. Even with this tragedy, they would not forgive his ideologies. Then comes the Fern Mullins incident. Fern is a new teacher, fresh from college, and still very naive. One of her students is a boy, only about 2 years younger than her, that is well known in town as a troublemaker, and is always drinking alcohol. One night, Fern accepts the boy's invitation to a dance. The boy gets drunk, and his mother, a religious fanatic, believes that Fern is a temptress out to get her son. The mother bawls out Miss Mullins and reports her to the school board to get her fired. The young teacher confides in Carol, telling her that she only accepted the invitation so she could dance, and didn't even spend much of the time with that boy. He had gotten drunk on whiskey and persuaded her to take a sip, which she did. 1 sip. The boy's mother, completely oblivious to her son's reckless and troublesome behavior, believes that Fern was to blame for all this. We, as the reader, have no reason to disbelieve Fern Mullins, and every reason to not believe Mrs. Bogart, the mother. That's how Lewis sets it up. And here comes his biggest denunciation of small towns. Carol makes it her duty to get Fern Mullins out of trouble by talking with those who have influence on the outcome of the case. While everyone seems to believe that the incident isn't so bad, Mrs. Bogarts is an influential member of the community, especially because she's the most involved person in the church and has close connections with enough people on the school board to side with her. Carol begs the townspeople to plead Miss Mullins' case. She knows, and says so, that not only will this terminate the young teacher's job in Gopher Prairie, but will affect her future employment too, because it'll be on her record. Her career would be ruined before it had barely even begun. Everyone knows that Mrs. Bogart's son is a hellion, and they sympathize with Fern's plight, which was caused by inexperience and naivety. Yet no one will even attempt to help her. They don't want to disrupt the social order by saying that Mrs. Bogart was mistaken. What ends up happening is that Fern Mullins is forced to resign instead of being fired, which really changes nothing, and she has to leave town, just like Miles before her. Carol receives a letter later on from Miss Mullins, and she says that she can't find a teaching job anywhere because of that mark on her record, and that she might marry a man just to have stability. Shortly after Miles leaves, in comes Eric Valborg, a young farmer's boy about 20 years old. He's a lover of poetry and the arts, despite not being able to pronounce the difficult words he wants to use. His appearance in the novel overlaps a bit with the Fern Mullins fiasco, but he plays a bigger role after she leaves town. Carol is torn because she's not sure if she's falling in love with Eric or not. She's certainly getting further away from her husband, since they don't seem to talk much anymore, at least not in a positive manner. As Carol and Eric get closer, people in town start to notice how close they've become, and how they often venture alone together, and start gossiping about it. This culminates in Will driving up to them when they're alone together, all but making them get in the car without directly saying so. He drops off Eric, and then he and Carol have an argument. In this argument, Will makes some fair points about Eric. He says, "What has he actually done in the art line? Has he done one first-class picture, or sketch, do you call it? Or one poem, or played the piano, or anything except gas about what he's going to do?" He also understands how the town works, and that the social flack will hit Carol and him, and everyone will talk about their private lives. He trusts that Carol won't betray him, but knows that the townspeople will assume the worst and spread the gossip. Carol has an epiphany moment, and knows that she must break off any relationship with Eric, who also leaves town. This marks a renewal of her love for Will yet again. One theme in the novel is the village virus, a term introduced by Guy Pollock when Carol meets him in his office for the first time. This is when someone with ambition moves to a small town such as Gopher Prairie, and it drains their ambitions and aspirations from them. And this is foreshadowing for Carol's experience there. After spending nearly half of the novel trying to change the town and make reforms, Carol just stops. Her attraction to Eric's relatively surface-level understanding of poetry and art was kind of the last vestige of that part of her. And then he left. Gopher Prairie starts to show promise for the future in the form of factories. Ironically, Carol does not like the man who has come into town to lead the charge. After having been somewhat calm about her ideas of reform and progressiveness, she and Will suddenly burst into an argument. He calls her seditious for having sympathy for some German farmers who are assumed, but not proven, to be pro-Germany in terms of the war that has broken out in Europe. Carol brings up her dissatisfaction with Gopher Prairie and her role in life in general. This reaches a climax when she says, "Was I more happy when I was drudging? I was not. I was just bedraggled and unhappy. It's work, but not my work. I could run an office or a library, or nurse and teach children. But solitary dishwashing isn't enough to satisfy me, or many other women. We're going to chuck it. We're going to wash 'em by machinery, and come out and play with you men in the offices and clubs and politics you've cleverly kept for yourselves. Oh, we're hopeless, we dissatisfied women." Their relationship sours again, But this time, Carol decides to take her son, Hugh, and move to Washington, D.C. for the time being, where she would stay for almost 2 years. There, she has a boring but not awful job, very similar to the one she had at the library at the beginning of the novel. She mingles with people of national importance, senators, financiers, and industrialists. She also finds out that Gopher Prairie's golden child, Percy Bresnahan, is not taken very seriously in the real big time. It seems like her experience in Washington is what Carol had wanted all along. But when looking back at Gopher Prairie and Will, her negative passion has faded away, replaced by a warm nostalgia. One passage of Carol's thoughts shows us Lewis's commentary on how small towns become idealized in people's minds. "I've been making the town a myth. This is how people keep up the tradition of the perfect hometown, the happy boyhood, the brilliant college friends. We forget so. I've been forgetting that Main Street doesn't think it's in the least lonely and pitiful. It thinks it's God's own country. It isn't waiting for me. It doesn't care." And even Carol starts to think of Gopher Prairie as her home. She's affected when Will comes to visit her, their marital status still uncertain to both of them. His visit especially convinces her to return to the town after a few more months in the city. It's very ironic that she only learns to appreciate Gopher Prairie after finally achieving her dream of living in a cultured, sophisticated place. In the last few pages of the book, we find out that Carol has another child, a girl this time, and that Carol has more or less assimilated into the town. She finally chooses to see a movie over reading a book, and starts calling the other women by their first names, rather than more formally and distant by using only their last names. And this is how the novel ends, with a short speech by Carol, who says, "But I have won in this. I've never excused my failures by sneering at my aspirations, by pretending to have gone beyond them. I do not admit that Main Street is as beautiful as it should be. I do not admit that Gopher Prairie is greater or more generous than Europe. I do not admit that dishwashing is enough to satisfy all women. I may not have fought the good fight, but I have kept the faith." To this, Will responds, "Sure, you bet you have. Well, good night. Sort of feels to me like it might snow tomorrow. Have to be thinking about putting up the storm windows pretty soon. Say, did you notice whether the girl put that screwdriver back?" So basically, he once again ignores her principles. While we do sometimes sympathize with Will and get frustrated with Carol, he never really tries to see things from Carol's perspective. He just seems to be waiting for her to see things his way, Gopher Prairie's way. And this ending shows that even after Carol was finally convinced that Gopher Prairie was a good place, she still has these ideals somewhere inside of her. And Will, despite his traumatic experience of nearly losing Carol for good, still doesn't see eye to eye with her. And to me, it can be interpreted as kind of a sad ending. Perhaps Carol has accepted her fate and will try to just take it at face value, retaining her ideals but unable to do anything with them in such a conservative, unchanging town, and has succumbed to the village virus. Main Street is interesting in its historical context. Before World War I, small towns were generally looked at with warmth, reverence, and nostalgia. And they were associated with close community ties that were seen as a great feature. But after the war, a more cynical view of small towns was popularized by Lewis. The close community ties turned into nosy people with apparently nothing better to do than snoop on others. And nostalgic changed to old-fashioned and too conservative. Of the citizens of Gopher Prairie and other main streets around the country, Lewis, speaking through Carol's thoughts, says that they are a savorless people, gulping tasteless food, and sitting afterward, coatless and thoughtless, in rocking chairs prickly with inane decorations, listening to mechanical music, saying mechanical things about the excellence of Ford automobiles, and viewing themselves as the greatest race in the world. He also says that the respectability of the Gopher Prairies is reinforced by vows of poverty and chastity in the matter of knowledge. Except for half a dozen in each town, the citizens are proud of that achievement of ignorance, which is so easy to come by. To be intellectual or artistic, or in their own word, to be highbrow, is to be priggish and of dubious virtue. Because of Main Street's popularity, Main Street became a common way of referring to small towns in general, similar to how Babbitt became a generalized term after Lewis's other hugely popular novel. But that's for another video. Main Street was made into a Hollywood movie in 1923, and it's interesting to note that there was some concern about showing it in small towns. With those last quotes, it's no wonder why that was. I'm honestly very disappointed that Main Street isn't in the public consciousness at all today. It's very similar to An American Tragedy in that people in the literary sphere recognize how good it is, but most outside of that have probably never even heard of it. Main Street, An American Tragedy, and The Great Gatsby all have pretty universal themes that could still easily be applied today. But I guess most people are less interested in social criticisms about small towns and more interested in big, lavish parties. Those are just the breaks. So those were my random thoughts on Main Street. Overall, I would definitely recommend it. The social commentary is very interesting, and quite a few points about small towns are still relevant today. And since it was one of the most popular novels of the 1920s, it's really important for cultural studies of the decade. And it's also great just to have a book that's well written and entertaining, but also critically acclaimed. For my next book review, I thought I would choose a slightly lesser-known novel. Well, lesser known generally, not to literature people, I guess. The book is Passing by Nella Larsen, originally published in 1929. It's a story about a young black woman's experience with the practice of passing, which, if you don't already know, was when a lighter-skinned person of color tried to pass as white by pretending to just be a tan white person, or sometimes making changes to their appearance for the same effect. This was a very controversial thing back in the 1920s, and was something that many members of the black community fighting tooth and nail for equality disdained. This was the time when the Harlem Renaissance was really picking up speed, and black pride was on the rise. Many were torn between thinking that people who tried to pass were betraying their own race or pitying them for not having self-respect. Nella Larsen, who was herself mixed race, became interested in the emerging Harlem Renaissance a few years before publishing this book when she moved to Harlem, and had previously worked as a nurse and a librarian. In 1925, she took a sabbatical in order to write her first novel, titled Quicksand, which was published in 1928. Just in case you don't know, I'll give a short cultural background to the main theme of passing. In the US in the decades before the 1920s, there was a peculiar class structure in black society, something which was most easily seen in New Orleans, but could also be found elsewhere. People who were part black and had a lighter skin tone generally received far better treatment than those with darker skin, though they were still not treated equally. In New Orleans, there was a whole class of people called Creoles, who had mixed African and French ancestry. They had effectively set themselves apart by defining themselves as being in a different category than darker-skinned black people. This included an emphasis on the arts, especially music, and many Creoles trained their children classically if they had the chance. This led to darker-skinned black people having separate theaters from Creoles, a sort of segregation within segregation. In other places, the disparity wasn't quite as large, but the difference in status was still pretty noticeable. For example, Duke Ellington, who had relatively lighter skin and grew up in Washington, D.C., was raised to appreciate life's finer things and proper behavior, something that helped contribute to his image of sophistication. This practice of lighter-skinned black people separating themselves from their more oppressed, darker-skinned brethren understandably caused resentment, since one group was clearly more privileged than the other. And this is where we enter the novel Passing. The main character is Irene Redfield, a light-skinned black woman living in Harlem who is unashamed of her race. She happens to meet an old friend named Claire Kendry, also a light-skinned black woman. But the difference is that Claire has spent the last 12 years or so since they last saw each other successfully passing as white. At first, things are fine between the two, though Irene finds Claire's desire to pass a bit strange. Among the three women we see at the beginning, Irene, Claire, and Gertrude, who is a minor character, there's a spectrum of sorts represented. Irene is married to a black man, and neither she nor her husband have any qualms about their race. Gertrude is passing, but her white husband knows that she's part black, and wouldn't have been bothered if their children had dark skin, whereas Gertrude feared that possibility. Claire's relationship with her husband, Jack Bellew, is more than a bit strange. Jack doesn't know that Claire is black, and during her get-together with Irene and Gertrude, he shows up and proceeds to talk about how much he hates black people. He even has a pet name for Claire, which is just a shortened version of the N-word, because he jokingly says that she seems to be getting darker as time goes by. While Claire and Gertrude are with Irene, they start mockingly talking about a black man who converted to Judaism, because they find the idea of a black Jew going to synagogue regularly and growing out a beard and mustache to be humorous. This is when Irene snaps a little bit at them, saying that perhaps the man was earnest in his religious conversion and shouldn't be made fun of. This whole scene shows the irony and hypocrisy of two black women, both of whom are passing, showing a cruel prejudice towards a darker-skinned individual for no apparent reason, and exposes their privileged attitude. This is something that, it's implied, a black woman unashamed of her race like Irene believes herself to be, wouldn't do. Irene's attitude towards Claire shifts throughout the story. She's glad to have seen her again after so long, then she doesn't want to answer her calls. She doesn't want to answer the door when Claire comes, but is happy to see her when she does. She really can't seem to make up her mind throughout the entire book. Claire's passing makes her uncomfortable, but she's also strangely drawn to it. Claire starts to become interested in associating with black people again, something she hasn't done for a very long time. And Irene, for some reason, starts to think that her own husband, Brian, is having an affair with her, perhaps thinking that he thinks Claire is more beautiful because she has lighter skin. Later on, Claire's husband, Jack, sees Irene holding hands with a more obviously black woman, and the encounter is extremely awkward. Irene realizes that the man has probably put the pieces together that his wife is not white. But Irene doesn't tell Claire about this. And in her mind, if Claire and Jack divorce, that could lead to Brian leaving her for Claire. But again, there really isn't any evidence of an affair, except in Irene's imagination. Claire, Irene, and Brian all go to a friend's house party. The party is interrupted when Jack shows up, and angrily shouts at Claire that he knows she's black. Claire then falls or is pushed out of a window. The exact details are never given, and she dies. So that's the main storyline, more or less. And now I'll just talk about some of my observations about themes. I didn't really look up anyone else's opinions before doing this, so these are just my first impressions, and feel free to disagree with me. Irene thinks about the idea of passing and the contradictory way Black society views it. In a very enlightening passage, she says, "It's funny about passing. We disapprove of it, and at the same time we condone it. It excites our contempt, and yet we rather admire it. We shy away from it with an odd kind of revulsion, but we protect it." Brian, however, just dismisses it as being the instinct of the race to survive and expand. Irene becomes a bit frustrated at this comment. Brian's cold, broadly scientific explanation is in sharp contrast to her passionate emotion at the whole thing. Irene seems to embody her thoughts about the contradictory views about people who pass. She keeps telling herself that she won't contact or reply to Claire ever again, but she always finds herself warmly accepting her again. Once, after Irene tears up a letter from her, Claire comes to her house. Even with the chance to ignore her, she doesn't, and she frequently mentions how beautiful Claire is. And in the beginning of the story, when Irene was sitting on the roof of a hotel, she was nervous that a woman, who turned out to be Claire, would find out that she was Black. This shows that while Irene strongly believes there's nothing wrong with her race and she isn't ashamed of it, in practice, she's more insecure about it than she seems to realize. This example also shows that Irene herself is willing to pass if the opportunity arises. Of course, she doesn't go fully in, but she's a middle-class woman who wants to live a middle-class lifestyle, with the certain degree of respectability that goes with it. She also passes if it prevents a situation from becoming uncomfortable or dangerous. She even admits her opportunistic passing when she says, "I don't believe I've ever gone native in my life except for the sake of convenience. Restaurants, theater tickets, and things like that. Never social, I mean, except once." She passes when Claire's racist husband joins the group of 3 women, and he's completely unaware that all of them are actually passing. Knowing his strong opinions on Black people, Irene probably passed to avoid a confrontation, though she also got a kick out of the irony as well. Irene, in explaining why white women want to dance with Black men at an event in Harlem, unconsciously reveals something about herself. At least I think so. Here's the quote. "I think that what they feel is, well, a kind of emotional excitement. You know, the sort of thing you feel in the presence of something strange, and even perhaps a bit repugnant to you. Something so different that it's really at the opposite end of the pole from all your accustomed notions of beauty. And I know colored girls who've experienced the same thing. The other way round, naturally." It sounds eerily similar to her overall view of Claire, don't you think? Except of course for the fact that she's not actually white, it shows that Irene is fascinated by Claire and her situation. Certainly she finds some of it repugnant, but she's also stricken by her beauty, which, again, she mentions a lot. The tension on the matter of race with Claire spills over into Irene's personal life, too. She and her husband, Brian, get into a heated discussion about how and when to teach their sons about lynching. Brian opts to be blunt and tell them early on so that they can find out what they're up against as soon as possible. Irene, on the other hand, believes that they should wait until the children are older and preserve their innocence so that they can be happy and not have such ugly things on their mind when they're so young. She later says that the most important thing in her life is security. This is why she's willing to pass. This is why she knows that she'll always have Brian as long as they have their sons, despite her suspicions of his possible affair with Claire. And her need for security is why she doesn't want her sons knowing about racism yet. But as Brian reminds her, their sons have already experienced racism when one of them was called a dirty N-word. But Irene skips over that important detail and stands her ground, continuing to argue in favor of preserving an innocence that is no longer there. I think that this runs parallel with Irene's denial about Claire, race, and passing. Just before this argument, Irene had reached a psychological breaking point. And here's a quote from the narrator that sheds some light on her mental state at that time, and why she's clinging desperately onto the last shred of her previous principles. For the first time, she suffered and rebelled because she was unable to disregard the burden of race. It was, she cried silently, enough to suffer as a woman, an individual, on one's own account, without having to suffer for the race as well. It was a brutality, and undeserved. Surely no other people so cursed as Ham's dark children. Claire seems to personify the practice of passing, and Irene represents the average, though more well-off, black/mixed-race American at that time. Like Irene, they might disdain the practice in theory, opting instead to seek pride in their race rather than cover it up. But there was just something about being able to be seen as white that had its temptations, whether it was increased self-worth or the greater opportunities it offered in such a discriminatory society. Nella Larson confronts a difficult and complex issue head-on, perhaps even saying that these subconscious thoughts are natural, though she doesn't condone acting on them per se. Claire's presence puts a strain on Irene's relationship with her husband, so those thoughts and passing in general are portrayed as being potentially very toxic and liable to tear apart the human psyche. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. The writing is very fluid and very modern. There's also a lot of depth to it, not just about race either. Irene's overall psychology is very complex and nuanced, and can definitely be explored very deeply. Because of the short length, it's a good book to read between two longer books. At least that's what I did. As I've said before, I'm not a professional book reviewer, so these are just a collection of my random thoughts and first impressions. And feel free to start a discussion in the comments about any of the points I've talked about or anything I left out. I know my coverage wasn't entirely comprehensive, but I'm hoping that it's enough to make someone want to read the book themselves. A Passage to India by the British author E.M. Forster was originally published in 1924. Forster, by that time, was a veteran writer who had achieved success across nearly 2 decades. And even though he would live all the way until 1970, this would be the last novel he published in his lifetime. First, let's go through the story quickly. A Passage to India is set in India, in a fictional town called Chandrapur during the British colonization period, based on Forster's own experiences of traveling there on 2 separate occasions. Perhaps the most important place to the British people there is the British Club, which acts as a social club as well as a place to play light sports. The relationship between colonizer and colonized in Chandrapur is what you might expect. The British who are part of the colonizing force are portrayed as arrogant, and they look down upon their Indian subjects. Many of the British civilians who come to Chandrapur also have tendencies to see Indian society as uncivilized, and a step, or rather many steps, below their native Britain. This mindset is perfectly captured in a line from the story where one of the British women talks about the activities of the Indians as if she were describing the movements of migratory birds. And the Indians generally dislike the British, and the fact that they are being subjected to colonialism by them. The same British woman that I just mentioned before, Mrs. Turton, was also shocked to learn that many of the Indians spoke English. This has the obvious implication that she, as well as other minor British characters, thought that they were incapable or too uncivilized to do so. Our main character is Aziz, a young Muslim Indian doctor. He's traditional and conservative, and a proud follower of his religion, something with which he finds difficulty compromising with others, especially the British, but also with the Hindus. The biggest representation of the British colonizers is Rani Heslop, the magistrate of Chandrapur, who is viciously disdainful toward the Indians. His mother is Mrs. Moore, who is fond of many of the Indians, especially Aziz, and is genuinely interested in Indian society and culture. And there's Mr. Fielding, who is the headmaster of a small college. Then there's also Adela, who comes to India to marry Rani after his mother, Mrs. Moore, set them up. She shares Mrs. Moore's interest in seeing the real India, and doesn't have anything against the Indians. Aziz befriends Mrs. Moore after an awkward run-in with her at his favorite mosque, where he was actually quite rude, though I'll get into that more later. He also becomes friends with Mr. Fielding, who is very tolerant and understanding of the Indians. Though Mr. Fielding doesn't quite share the same enthusiasm for learning more about their culture and society as Mrs. Moore and Adela. However, Aziz is apparently unable to become close with Adela, partly because she's planning to marry Rani Heslop, who's the main villain on the British side. And the other reason is pretty shallow, to be honest. He finds her deeply unattractive. This excerpt explains what he first thought of her. He wondered how God could have been so unkind to any female form. His attitude towards her remained entirely straightforward in consequence. But nonetheless, Aziz and Adela remained on good terms for the time being, just not particularly close. After a few social gatherings in the first half of the book, we get to see what the characters think about each other. Then, Aziz invites a small group to go to the Marabar Caves to do some sightseeing. Among those in this group are Mr. Fielding, Mrs. Moore, and Adela. The expedition is by all accounts disappointing, and no one is especially happy about it. It's a long journey out to the caves, and they aren't really all that interesting. At one point, Aziz finds himself alone with Adela, but because they're not good conversation partners, there's little dialogue between them. Adela finds herself thinking about her impending marriage to Rani, and she's torn about it because she doesn't really love him. Aziz holds her hand, but not in any inappropriate way. And actually, Adela finds him unattractive too. She thinks he's too exotic. In other words, it's because of his race. Her thoughts about marriage lead her to ask Aziz about his own marriage, but she upsets him when she asks if he has multiple wives, an assumption that Aziz takes personally, though Adela doesn't seem to realize that she upset him. He leaves her for a short time, then returns to find her gone, and finds her broken field glasses on the ground and picks them up. He makes his way out of the cave, and then finds Fielding. They both find out that Adela had quickly returned back to Chandrapur, but they don't question why too much. When they return to Chandrapur, Aziz is immediately placed under arrest without explanation, and he begins sobbing over this hit to his good name and dignity. Fielding is shocked and persistently asks why Aziz was arrested, and accuses the British officials of unjust treatment. We find out that the crime Aziz is accused of is forced relations with Adela. Fielding refuses to believe this, since he thinks Aziz is perhaps the most straight-laced man he knows, or in his words, that he is incapable of infamy. Mr. McBride, the official Fielding is talking to, says that Fielding just doesn't understand Indians like he does, and that there's no such thing as a morally good Indian. And really, we as the reader know for a fact that Aziz is innocent, because the narrator is omniscient, so an unreliable narrator is impossible. We saw for ourselves Aziz's movements, and know that he did absolutely nothing wrong. Ironically, the last interaction Aziz and Adela had was when she had made him deeply upset for accidentally questioning his devotion to his wife. So the idea of him actually forcing himself upon Adela is almost inconceivable. So the news spreads to the other British people at the British Club in Chandrapur. Ronnie Heaslop is practically broken at the news of Adela, but still functional. Fielding expresses his belief that Aziz is innocent to all the assembled British people, and he voluntarily withdraws his club membership, which would have been taken from him anyway. The fact that he doesn't believe Adela's story or entertains the possibility that she was mistaken is unacceptable to the others. This puts Fielding on the side of the Indians, and this incident pretty much turns into an us versus them situation. Then we get Adela's version of the story, which is given to us in the form of her thinking about how she will tell the other British people. And it isn't as graphic or even as clear as we were led to believe by the likes of Mr. McBride, who was shaken up at the whole incident. This is what Adela thought in full. I went into this detestable cave, and I remember scratching the wall with my fingernail to start the usual echo. And then, as I was saying, there was this shadow, or sort of shadow, down the entrance tunnel, bottling me up. It seemed like an age, but I suppose the whole thing can't have lasted 30 seconds, really. I hit at him with the glasses. He pulled me round the cave by the strap. It broke. I escaped. That's all. He never actually touched me once. It all seems such nonsense. But then something changes. After Adela visits Miss Moore for the first time since the incident, and the old lady expresses her newfound cynical views on life, Adela begins to doubt that it was Aziz who had assaulted her in the caves. She even tells Ronnie this epiphany, but he doesn't quite believe her. Mrs. Moore cynically expresses her belief in Aziz's innocence, which only makes Adela more sure of her mistake. Ronnie tells both of them to give him more evidence of Aziz's innocence if they have any, but their belief is based on his character alone, so there's nothing they can give. The news of the incident and the accusation have already spread and caused problems on both the British and Indian sides. In the words of Mrs. Moore, Adela has started the machinery. It will work to its end. Ronnie and the other colonialists persuade Adela to see the trial through to the end, though she still has reservations. But under oath and tortured by her moral dilemma, Adela admits that she believes she made a mistake, and the judge dismisses the case and all charges against Aziz are dropped. The Indians celebrate this victory, if you can call it that. In Adela's interactions with Indians after the trial, they're uncomfortable, though they don't exactly hate her. Fielding, though bitter toward her at first, begins to better understand her predicament and even comes to respect her. It's about this time that we learn Mrs. Moore has died. She had been forced to return to England by her son, Ronnie, though she hadn't really wanted to stay in India anyway after what had happened. Meanwhile, Aziz and Fielding interact for the first time since the end of the trial. Aziz's scorn for the British has only increased, and he has completely disassociated from Adela. Fielding tries to convince him that she has redeemed herself, but Aziz does not accept this transformation, and is actually pretty vindictive against her and wants to sue her. Although he's eventually convinced not to do so, because of this disagreement, Fielding and Aziz have a falling out. Adela then leaves India. Then, soon after, Fielding also leaves, both of them heading back to England. We also find out that Fielding gets married to Ronnie Heaslop's sister. And near the very end of the novel, it's mentioned that the British authorities in India kept a watch over Aziz for the rest of his life because of the trial. Even though he lived out a relatively happy life, one accusation made against him years ago still hung over him. From my surface level digging into other people's opinions about A Passage to India, there seems to have been a lot of literary debate about this book due to the sensitive subject matter involved. And I'm no expert, but I'll give my opinion. So keep it in mind that these are not necessarily facts, just my thoughts. There's a kind of irony in the novel that I found interesting. Almost all the Indian characters disdain, or at least don't sympathize with the British colonizers, who make up a minority group in India. And all the different faiths of the country are against the British. Yet most of the main Indian characters are Muslims, a minority group among the Indians, while the Hindus, the majority group, are pushed to the background of the story. And the hypocritical part of Aziz's character is that he dislikes Hindus. We don't really get a definite reason why this is, except that he finds them dirty and polluting, which certainly sounds to me like just negative stereotypes more than anything. You would think that being treated as a lesser being would humble Aziz, as well as others in his community, and make them rethink things like stereotyping and unfair prejudice against other groups. But it seems that this is not the case. There's also another scene in the story that shows this hypocritical tendency of Aziz. When he first meets Mrs. Moore in a mosque, he assumes that she's ignorant of Muslim customs, and rudely tells her to take off her shoes when inside of a mosque. He hadn't realized that she had already taken off her shoes, so it was just an assumption on his part. Of course, you can make the argument that the British colonizers had probably repeatedly ignored such a rule for years, and had disgraced the holy place with their unclean practices, and that this is what had caused resentment from Aziz. But that would be looking outside of the text, so it's impossible to know for sure. Regardless of that, Aziz does apologize for his quick assumption, and they proceed to have a pleasant conversation. One of the great ironies of this novel is the fact that Mrs. Moore and Adela came to see the real India, as opposed to the British-influenced version. But it seems that the British influence was too pervasive in their experience, and it's difficult for them, though especially for Adela, to completely disregard their own cultural values and norms. And it can be argued that they did in fact see the real India, at least the real India of that specific time. British colonialism was such a big influence, especially with its unjust treatment of the Indians, that you can say that it was the real India. The traditional India had been changed, largely against its will, and this is what it had turned into. There was also another thought I had, but this might be reaching a bit, I don't know. When the news about Aziz's alleged crime breaks out in Chandrapur, all of the British men, except Fielding, do not refer to either Aziz or Adela by name. Instead, they just allude to them. When I read this, I thought that it might be symbolic of the British attitude toward problems in colonial India at that time. By this, I mean that they recognize that there are problems, but they don't address them directly, and normal people are told to ignore it and keep on with their normal activities as if nothing was wrong. This is exactly what Mr. McBride tells the English women to do. Like I said, maybe this is a stretch, but I couldn't help thinking that. One of the most remarkable character changes in the story is that of Mrs. Moore. She had been the shining light among the British people, able to respect and appreciate the Indians and their culture, and was generally all around cheerful and optimistic. She represented a mutual understanding among the British and the Indians, and her later bitterness and disillusionment echo Forster's pessimistic commentary on the whole subject. After the incident with Adela, she becomes angry and irritable, with a just irritation against the human race. And her death means the death of progress in British-Indian relations. Aziz and Fielding's relationship is perhaps the most important one of the novel. They quickly grew to like each other in the beginning, but the atmosphere of British colonialism, represented by Aziz's unfair treatment during the trial, destroys any possibility of them mending their friendship. And aspects of their personalities, influenced largely by their respective cultures, also contribute to this. For example, Fielding's cold logic versus Aziz's poetic imagination often clash. The themes of a lack of mutual understanding and complete ignorance of each other's cultures are central to A Passage to India. Both sides are pretty uncompromising when it comes to tolerance and acceptance of each other. There is resentment because a clear racial hierarchy has been established, where one group, the British, was automatically higher in status than the other, the Indians. Even though the prospect of cooperation was looking good at first, the incident with Adela pushes them further away from each other than ever before. Aziz then seeks cooperation with the Hindus to become a unified India against the British. The novel showcases different types of British people in terms of colonialism. First, there's Mrs. Moore, who wins the respect of the Indians for her sensitive treatment and respect of them. Then there's her son, Ronnie Heaslop, who is pretty much the exact opposite. He despises Indians and India, and only causes their resentment of him and his administration. Then there are the more nuanced cases of Fielding and Adela. Fielding is generally the Indians' ally, though he can never be quite on the same page as them culturally. Adela is naive and ignorant of the situation in India. She inadvertently causes such a mess between the British and the Indians and regrets it deeply. However, she's much more preferable to the other English women, except Mrs. Moore, who are condescending and treat Indian culture as more of a distasteful novelty than anything. At the very end of the novel, Forster sums up his complicated view of the possibility of an Indian-British friendship through Aziz. After proclaiming that India should be unified under all its groups, mainly the Hindus, the Muslims, and the Sikhs, he says to Fielding, "Down with the English anyhow, that's certain. Clear out, you fellows, double quick, I say. If it's 50 or 500 years, we shall get rid of you. Yes, we shall drive every blasted Englishman to the sea. And then, you and I can be friends." Fielding responds, "Why can't we be friends now? It's what I want. It's what you want." But the question goes unanswered, ultimately leaving it open to interpretation. I found this book to be a more challenging read than others I've reviewed. To me at least, Forster seems to write in a more traditional style, with sophisticated words, difficult syntax, etc. I'm not sure if the fact that he was British has anything to do with it, or if it's because he was middle-aged and so wrote in a more Victorian style. Though Theodore Dreiser was older than him and didn't write like that, so I don't know. Compared with Dreiser's writing in An American Tragedy, which I guess is the standard I'm going to use for this review, Forster's writing demands more active attention. I was able to read An American Tragedy very smoothly for leisure reading, but I didn't really have the same feeling while reading A Passage to India. And I have a couple reasons for this. First, the characters and names. There are a lot of characters, even within the group of important ones. There has to be at least double than the average book, at least that's my impression. And because this takes place in India, there are a lot of Indian names. For someone like me, who's used to a different culture and language from where this story takes place, these names taken from a vastly different language get kind of muddled together and are harder to remember. So I kept finding myself wondering if a minor Indian character had already been mentioned or is being introduced. And if they had already been mentioned, I no longer knew what they did or what purpose they served to the story. This issue wasn't helped by the fact that Forster is very sparse with names during long dialogue sequences. This was a big obstacle that could be quite frustrating. I often got lost in dialogue and was unsure who the actions and words were being attributed to. For example, in a conversation among multiple men or multiple women, it would just say, "he did this," or "he said," but the name hadn't been mentioned for a few paragraphs, so there was a lot of backtracking on my part. my overall appraisal of A Passage to India is a bit difficult to articulate. There's a lot to digest, and I found much of the symbolism a bit convoluted and hard to grasp, at least for a normal, non-literary scholar like me. For me, this novel demanded a lot of attention and focus to be able to catch everything. A few times, I found myself having to go back to make sure I understood what had happened. However, this book addressed an issue that was not often addressed in literature at that time. And because Forster was British and had traveled to India, he had a keener understanding of the situation there than other writers. And Forster's treatment of India not just as an exotic destination for traveling is pretty refreshing compared to some other popular novels of the time. He sees Indians not as an uncivilized people the British should look down upon, but as nuanced human beings that are just as flawed as any European. I think it's also important to note that A Passage to India doesn't completely echo the mainstream belief in the Western world today that colonialism is entirely unacceptable. Forster never really condemns the British presence in India as morally wrong, but rather he seems to urge mutual understanding as the solution to the problems there. The situation was terrible there because of the attitude and the way the British went about it, but the idea as a whole wasn't necessarily bad. At least, that's what I took away. But the ending is ambiguous, so I recommend that you read the book for yourself and figure out your own opinion. And here's another random thought I had. I doubt this was a conscious effort on Forster's part, but the exotic setting was perfect for 1920s readers, when far-off lands were very much in vogue. This must have played on the expectations of some readers, and I can imagine someone expecting a romantic journey into the Indian land of jungles and tigers, and instead got a commentary on colonialism. Regardless of what I think, more qualified people have consistently ranked A Passage to India as one of the best novels of the 1920s, and of the 20th century as a whole. But this review was just from the perspective of a normal person, and I definitely tend to enjoy books that walk the line of meaningful, thought-provoking messages and readability. But I can't say that I really disliked it, just that there are other 1920s novels that I like better, and I truly did find the overall message of A Passage to India very interesting. Well, that'll just about end my ramblings about this book. Maybe there was something of substance there, maybe not. You be the judge. I just want to do an overview about Calvin Coolidge's 1929 autobiography and talk about some of the key points, mostly the stuff about the 1920s and his presidency, and share some of the more interesting excerpts. Then finally give my opinion on the book as a whole. But first, let's go over a little bit of background. Calvin Coolidge left office on March 4th, 1929, after serving as president for 5.5 years, having taken over after the sudden death of President Warren G. Harding on August 2nd, 1923, then easily winning the 1924 election in his own right. He published his autobiography shortly after leaving office. Compared to previous presidential autobiographies, as well as later ones, Coolidge's was pretty short. For example, my copy has 247 pages with fairly large print, while, for example, Theodore Roosevelt's was 647 pages, and Herbert Hoover's was 538 pages. Shortly after its publication, Coolidge's autobiography was actually very successful, and parts of it were even printed in newspapers, providing easier access to it for more Americans. I'm just gonna skim over the first half and save most of the attention for the 1920 sections. And besides, there aren't really any big revelations that Coolidge writes about his childhood. He very briefly talks about how his mother died when he was 12, and his younger sister died when he was 18. His father introduced him to government and law, and overall he said of his upbringing, It would be hard to imagine better surroundings for the development of a boy than those which I had. Then he goes on about his education and throws in a few anecdotes here and there about hard work and general advice. The most important thing about this stage of his life was going away to a boarding school, which he described as his first great adventure. He also briefly described many of his teachers and what he got out of their lectures. He moved on to Amherst University, and after completing his education there, he eventually established a law office, then slowly climbed his way up the political ladder. He started in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, then became mayor of Northampton, then Massachusetts senator, then president of the Senate, then lieutenant governor, and later governor of Massachusetts. In September 1919, Governor Coolidge was faced with the pressing issue of the Boston police strike, when 3/4 of the entire Boston police force did not show up for their jobs. Coolidge was furious, believing that the officers were acting in their own self-interest rather than for the public, which was supposed to be their sworn duty. Metropolitan and state police were brought in after rioting ensued that night after it became public knowledge that there were few policemen in the city. Coolidge stated that he had largely been supportive of labor rights previously, but when it came to those working in sectors owned by the state, especially the police, who were in charge of public safety, he looked on their neglect of public duty with disgust, thinking that their actions were detrimental and possibly threatening to the citizens. During the crisis, Governor Coolidge received public acclaim for his rebuttal of the labor union leader Samuel Gompers, writing, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anytime or anywhere." Coolidge also refused to allow any of the offending officers to rejoin the police force. Coolidge's actions during the crisis and his apparent concern for the public at large helped advance his political position even further, despite the fact that he himself had not set his sights on public office past the governorship. This would lead him down the road to the highest office in the country. Coolidge described his nomination for vice president in a pretty detailed way, so I'm just going to summarize it briefly. Basically, what happened, he said, was that he was initially supported by many in his state as the Republican nominee for president, but on the national level, he was supported as the nominee for vice president. He wrote that while he wasn't very interested in being vice president and didn't publicly voice any interest for it, when he received the nomination, he accepted it. That made him the running mate of Senator Warren G. Harding. Coolidge credited race consciousness as a key factor leading to the Republican victory in the 1920 presidential election. By this, he wasn't referring to Black Americans, but rather the various European immigrant groups throughout the country, who were largely against joining the League of Nations that President Woodrow Wilson had been instrumental in creating. He wrote, "While they were loyal to the United States, they did not wish to become involved in any Old World disputes, were greatly relieved that the war was finished, and generally opposed to the League of Nations. Such a combination gave us an overwhelming victory." As for his role as vice president, he didn't really talk too much about it. He does dispel the commonly held belief that the vice president attends endless dinners and social functions, saying that in his experience, he only had to attend those sort of events about 3 times a week. And he said that he enjoyed presiding over the Senate and furthering his education about the functions of government. Probably the most interesting and descriptive part of the autobiography is when Coolidge recounts being suddenly and unexpectedly sworn in as president. Here's a condensed version of what he wrote about it. "On the night of August 2nd, 1923, I was awakened by my father coming up the stairs calling my name. I noticed that his voice trembled. As the only times I had ever observed that before were when death had visited our family, I knew that something of the gravest nature had occurred. He had been the first to address me as President of the United States. He placed in my hands an official report and told me that President Harding had just passed away. My wife and I at once dressed. Before leaving the room, I knelt down, and, with the same prayer with which I have since approached the altar of the church, asked God to bless the American people and give me power to serve them. I had been examining the Constitution to determine what might be necessary for qualifying by taking the oath of office. It is not clear that any additional oath is required beyond what is taken by the Vice President when he is sworn into office. It is the same form as that taken by the President. Having found this form in the Constitution, I had it set up on the typewriter, and the oath was administered by my father in his capacity as a notary public. The oath was taken in what we always called the sitting room, by the light of the kerosene lamp. The Bible which had belonged to my mother lay on the table at my hand. It was not officially used, as it is not the practice in Vermont or Massachusetts to use a Bible in connection with the administration of an oath. Besides my father and myself, there were present my wife, Senator Dale, who happened to be stopping a few miles away, my stenographer, and my chauffeur. Personal tragedy plagued the first few years of Coolidge's time as president. First, his youngest son, Calvin Jr., died on July 7, 1924. The 16-year-old had gotten a blister on his toe while playing lawn tennis at the south grounds of the White House, which led to blood poisoning. Coolidge hinted that this greatly affected his performance as president, writing, "When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him." In the end, Coolidge and his wife accepted the death as God's divine will. Then, less than 2 years later, Coolidge's father died. His health had slowly declined, and his death was expected for a while before it happened. But the president hadn't had time to visit him in his last days, having instead to resort to using a telephone. And he had been very close with his father. Coolidge felt a huge personal guilt about the death of his son, and deeply regretted the fact that he couldn't be with his father when he was on his deathbed. He somewhat blamed his rising to the office of president for how things turned out. Because his son had received his fatal injury while at the White House, he wondered how things would have turned out if the boy had never lived there. Coolidge gave one final statement on the subject of those 2 deaths, saying simply, "It costs a great deal to be president." But going to the more average day in his life as president, Coolidge also gave his normal schedule, which I've condensed for the sake of time. It was my custom to be out of bed about 6:30, except in the darkest mornings of winter. It was my intention to take a short walk before breakfast, which Mrs. Coolidge and I ate together in our rooms. For me, there was fruit and about 1/2 cup of coffee, with a homemade cereal made from boiling together 2 parts of unground wheat with 1 part of rye. To this was added a roll and a strip of bacon, which went mostly to our dogs. Soon after 8 found me dictating in the White House library in preparation for some public utterance. This would go on for more than an hour, after which I began to receive callers at the office. Most of these came by appointment, but in addition to the average of 6 to 8, there would be as many from my cabinet and the Congress, to whom I was always accessible. About 12:15, those began to be brought in who were to be somewhat formally presented. At 12:30, the doors were opened, and a long line passed by who wished merely to shake hands with the president. On one occasion, I shook hands with 1,934 minutes, which is probably my record. Lunch came at 1 o'clock, at which we usually had guests. About an hour was devoted to rest before returning to the office, where the afternoon was reserved for attention to the immense number of documents which pass over the desk of the president. Before dinner, another walk was in order, followed by exercises on some of the vibrating machines kept in my room. We gathered at the dinner table at 7 o'clock, and within 3/4 of an hour, work would be resumed with my stenographer to continue until about 10 o'clock. For most of the 2 chapters dedicated to his presidency, he mostly just talked about his political philosophies in detail, rather than any specific stories about his time in office. In fact, only about 25% of the book concerns his presidency at all. The book ends with Coolidge explaining why he chose not to run for a second term, which had happened only 2 years before the book was published. He basically just said that it was in the best interest of the people and the country that he didn't seek re-election, and he hadn't really wanted to run that much anyway. My biggest criticism of this autobiography is its lack of details on certain topics, and a lack of anecdotal stories. It seems that it was written hastily, especially considering that it was published less than a year after Coolidge left office. And for whatever reason, Coolidge omits many things that could have been very interesting to the reader. For example, he wrote of his time as vice president, "I also came into contact with many of the important peoples of the United States and foreign countries." But that's it. He sometimes listed names of prominent people he met, but didn't really say anything about them. Everything is very matter-of-fact, which I guess perfectly represents Coolidge's personality. He also didn't really discuss some of the most important and controversial topics of his presidency, like Prohibition, the Immigration Act of 1924, the Muscle Shoals debate, or the popularity of the KKK, and a bunch of other stuff. And he also provided very little information about his mother and sister who had died. I can only assume that they played some kind of role in shaping who Calvin Coolidge was as a person, but he didn't touch on that subject very much at all. But he rarely revealed his deep emotions, so it's not that surprising. So once again, this just represents his personality. But at the same time, the short and simple style of Coolidge's autobiography made it very accessible to people at the time. They didn't have to spend a large amount of money or have a college degree to learn more about their former president. Coolidge said that he strove to keep his memoir brief, simple, and gentle, and also went on to say that he intended it to be a guide for young people, and not just a guide on how to become president, but how to be a good citizen. So, from a historian's perspective, the autobiography is nothing special. It gives little information about important events and Coolidge's specific motivations. But that's exactly as Coolidge wanted it. He didn't write it for historians, he wrote it for the people. I want to round off this section with a quote from the autobiography, which I think is especially poignant. "The words of the president have an enormous weight, and ought not to be used indiscriminately. It would be exceedingly easy to set the country all by the ears and foment hatreds and jealousies, which, by destroying faith and confidence, would help nobody and harm everybody. The end would be the destruction of all progress." And here's your bonus photo for making it to the end. And no, I won't give you the context, just this weird image. I hope you enjoyed these discussions, whether or not you've read any of these books before. If you haven't, then maybe you'll know now which ones might be up your alley. I have a lot of 1920s novels to read through, and I've even bought some of them, but with all the other reading I have to do for grad classes and research for other videos, I haven't had the time to go through as many as I want to. But I have a plan to try and fit in more of them in the kind of near future, but we'll see. Well, that's all for now, all you sheiks and gals out there, but stay tuned for more tales from the Jazz Age.